Here today for another episode of the Star Wars podcast. Today's topic is about the new comic book that recently came out, Star Wars #1. It is the first in line of the new Marvel comic books. And what is so important about this is these are the first canon comic books to ever come out, and up till 2015, from the I think is early 90s, Dark Horse Comics have been the ones in charge of Star Wars comics. So Marvel originally had them, and now they're taking them back since Disney bought Lucasfilms a couple years back. So what we're seeing here is this is an actual Star Wars story that's in the actual storyline compared to all the other comics from the past, which to me is really important because what this Disney canon stuff is going to do is really expand the Star Wars universe and help us, and is going to give an advantage to Star Wars because everything else in the past was mumble jumbled and it might intersect with something else, so the stories may still be very good. Now none of the stories should hopefully conflict with each other. So that's really important because this is the first canon one. So this is basically setting up for the rest of the ones to come. The other thing I want you guys to understand while I'm reviewing this is that this is my first comic book, so I don't know that much when it comes to comics, but I have read it and I really enjoyed it. So, let's get into it. This comic starts right after episode 4. So this is before an Empire Strikes Back, but basically maybe a month, maybe 2 months after uh New Hope, when the Death Star was destroyed. So the Empire is still going to be suffering from the fact that the Death Star is destroyed and whatever resources they put into that. The location of this comic book, the first one, Star Wars #1, starts is at Simoon 1 at an Imperial construction facility where they are building stuff. And other than the facility itself, the moon is basically a junkyard. Doesn't mean it doesn't have natives to it, as you find out in the comic book it does. Warning, there's going to be spoilers on this. But it still, basically, this is the scene that we are in. We are on a junked planet that is very industrialized, and other than construction facilities on the planet has been turned into a junkyard of things that can be reused again and again. The main characters in this at the moment seem to be Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Leia, but C-3PO, Chewbacca, and R2-D2 are in here as well. And we've also run into a couple of Imperial commanders and Darth Vader, who is supposed to be the negotiator. From what I can tell, this is a really kind of classic Star Wars story. They are really putting the Star Wars into this. We have Luke and Leia hidden as skiff guards, and Han Solo is acting like he's an emissary for Jabba the Hutt, almost like they're dressed up as stormtroopers going to Death Star. Or Lando Calrissian as a skiff guard in Jabba's palace. I mean, it's really classic, and you get some elements of that. There is Han and Leia bickering. Basically, they put Star Wars into it. There's even a hand cut off. Not that it's any of the characters we love, but there's still a hand cut off, which is an element that we see in a couple times in Star Wars as well. Luke's outfit. You may recognize it. At the end of episode 4, during the medal ceremony, Luke wore it. It's the one in the picture on the screen here with the golden vest and whatnot. So they're taking from past things characters may have worn and trying to give the characters the look that they would actually have, which is very important. But they aren't necessarily giving Luke that mature look because Luke doesn't really get the mature look till episode 6. Episode 5 he gets training look. Episode 4 he still looks like that innocent farm boy. So it's kind of in between like the innocent farm boy and he's training to become a Jedi in episode 5. But nonetheless, this is something that we should know of from episode 4, and it kind of helps, it more heightens that feel of this being a classic Star Wars story. This, from what I can tell, this comic book has really good illustrations that really help immerse you in the story. It's hard to really get into the illustrations when you first read it, but when you go through the second time, maybe you're just looking at the pictures or whatnot, you can really get the feel for the story, and it really brings you in. You almost feel like, oh, I really want them to make a movie out of this. All we know, eventually they will actually make a movie out of these comic books, but for now, they feel like the movie. That's what matters. Um, while we're on the subject of the illustrations, I might as well give credit to the people who wrote these comics. The writer was Jason Aaron, and the artist was John Cassidy, and the colorist was Laura Martin. So y'all may recognize them from other places. I have no idea, but those were the people who really put their time and effort into making the comic. You have to remember, a lot of people that are going to be writing and making these comics are actual Star Wars fans. So they kind of are going to be trying to put their own personal touch into the Star Wars universe, but they're also going to make sure it feels like Star Wars, because a true Star Wars fan isn't going to take the Star Wars out of Star Wars. They're going to leave it in there. And the fact that there are so many Star Wars fans out there, and many of them went to the jobs that they have taken because of Star Wars, there are many people willing to do these. Also, the other thing I want to point out is that these stories, as canon, are worked on as a whole by a story group. There is a story group that has, I don't know most people in it. One of them is Pablo Hidalgo, who also works on some of the Star Wars Rebels stuff. But they basically help approve and guide not only comic book authors, but also book authors and the people making the television show, Dave Filoni and whatnot, on how they're going to make the how characters should be portrayed. They aren't going to allow them to portray character in a manner that isn't that is going to take away from the character, or take away from what the character is supposed to be like. So that is very beneficial, and this also, again, is dealing with all the canon stuff I was talking about earlier. That's going to give a big advantage to Star Wars in the future, and I would really like to commend Disney on the job they've done so far with Star Wars and its canonicity. And though many people may be disappointed that all the old Star Wars books became legends, I feel like in the long run, it's the most beneficial thing Disney could have done. The most beneficial decision was to say that everything previous, other than these TV shows and the movies, is no longer canon, but we aren't going to just necessarily go by and say they're not there. And one other thing those old Star Wars fans may be wanting to pay attention to is, as these stories come out, do look through them for things you may recognize from the expanded universe, because I'd like to tell you that they've taken quite a bit from the expanded universe when making these stories. If you just look at the Clone Wars, there are several bounty hunters and even planets that have arisen because from the expanded universe that are canon because of the expanded universe. So it's still going to have effect, and for all we know, we'll see characters we love, such as Jade and Thrawn, show up later in canon stories. But for now, enjoy what we have with Star Wars #1 comic, the first canon and Marvel comic of 2015 and forever from these groups. So, this is Indiana signing out.